Hello and good morning, everybody. We are just doing our final tech checks. I had a slight broken internet connection, but it's okay because I'm here now. So, welcome to the first day of Communicate 2022 from what is a beautiful and somewhat rainy morning here in Bristol. Today's session, we're going to be talking about the Nature Writing Prize for Working Class Writers, which is currently in its third year, I believe. We're also going to concentrate on thinking about the voices that we hear and that we don't hear in popular nature writing, and how the organisations that we all work for or that we all engage with can think about better ways to support working class writers and audiences to gain access to both nature, the natural environment, and understand themselves as somebody with voices and stories that are valid to be heard. So I'm joined today by two people who are already doing amazing work in this area. Author and activist Natasha Carthew and Rose McNeil, CEO of Campaign for National Parks. So I'm not going to be able to do them justice in my attempted introduction, so I'm going to hand over to them to introduce themselves. So Natasha, would you be able to say a quick something about yourself for the audience?
Hi everyone, thanks for joining us today. My name is Natasha Carthew and I'm Artistic Director of Class Festival, and I'm also founder of the Working Class Nature Prize, which, yes, Simon's right, it's in the third year. I'm also a writer. I've got 8 books under my belt with National Trust, River Run, Bloomsbury, and a few others. My memoir is coming out Undercurrent in April with Hodder. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to today. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Rose.
Hi everyone, it's really good to be here at Communicate again. So I am Chief Executive of Campaign for National Parks, which is an independent charity that campaigns to protect the 13 national parks in England and Wales and make them nature rich and inclusive. And we are one of the sponsors of the Working Class Nature Prize, which we're really pleased to be involved with.
Thank you very much both. My name's Simon Moreton. I'm an artist and an author, and I also work for the University of the West of England here in Bristol. So format-wise, we're going to have a little bit of a chat for probably about the next 30 minutes or so, and then hopefully we'll have some time at the end for some questions from you, the audience. If you have questions that pop into your brain, we're going to be using the Q&A function to gather questions. So throughout the chat, just pop your questions in that Q&A box, which you can access just down on the bottom menu bar of the Zoom, in between raise hand and Q&A, raise hand and backstage, sorry, and then we'll those questions and try and get to them as many as we can towards the end. So to kick off, really, I think let's set the scene a little bit for today's conversation. So I was wondering, Natasha, if you could tell us a little bit more about the Nature Writing Prize for Working Class Writers and how it kind of came about.
For me, I started it in 2020, and it came about because I just thought, I write fiction, I write poetry, but also kind of under the banner of nature writer, I suppose, that we weren't being represented in literature, in magazine articles. The same writers seemed to be popping up, and it was mostly white male, middle class nature writers. And when I say to people about nature writing, people think of the old kind of flat cap, a posh guy in a tweed suit walking over kind of dales and hills and lamenting about beautiful nature, which is absolutely fine. And I've not got a problem with that at all, of course. But for me, it's about reclaiming nature for us, kind of the common people, I suppose. So it's like nature writing should be for everyone. And people should feel that it's something that they can do wherever they are, wherever they live. Doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be living in the country. You could be living in cities, in towns and all the grey areas in between kind of thing. So for me, I wanted to celebrate writers, working class writers who have similar backgrounds to me, who come from low social economic backgrounds as children. And really just to explore those wild places and get their writing out there. I wanted people to read these stories, read these kind of articles or whatever it might be. It might be memoir, it could be field notes, just to get a sense of nature and its wide spectrum, not just that kind of that image that people have as a nature writer. Nature writers, we are all nature writers and we all have nature inside. We write about the nature inside of ourselves as well as nature writers. So for me, it's really important to just to explore and then to celebrate those voices, those authentic voices that are everywhere.
Thank you, amazing. And Rose, might you be able to say a little bit about how your work and the work of your organisation kind of intersects with that kind of mission, and maybe a little bit how you came to be involved in the prize as well?
Yeah, so I just say that first of all, what Natasha was saying just really resonates with me personally. So I'm, a big fan of nature writing. I think it's incredibly powerful both to individuals, but actually in terms of the way it influences the thinking in our sector is so influential. But actually, even when I think of some of my favourite nature writers, there's always sort of a man like spending weeks walking through a landscape, which sounds amazing, but I always think as someone, grew up a working class background, I think, wow, what a luxury, how does he afford to do that? And immediately it feels quite othering. And that's really important, not just as a personal thing, but nature can't afford to be thought of as a luxury. We're in it's climate and nature an emergency, and it's absolutely critical that we can make the connection to nature in all of our lives. And so we need to urgently tell lots more stories about nature if we're ever going to tackle those sort of big issues. And so I think that's why the prize is just so important, and what Natasha's doing is really important. And shall I talk a little bit about the Campaign for National Parks? So we're an independent charity that dates back to the 1930s, which was set up to campaign for the creation of national parks in England and Wales. And we've been campaigning ever since. We're, campaigning today about the massive cuts to national park budgets. But actually our movement has its very roots in working class activism. So back in the 1930s, working class people actually had to sort of, be really radical and defy the law to walk out over those hills and moorlands, which would become the first national park. And there was a young man who, was really part of that. He was Benny Rothman. He was very involved in sort of setting up groups for people that worked in factories in Manchester and the surrounding hills to get out walking. And he led a trespass. And speaking at his trial, and if I will read the Kinder trespass, he said, then, we ramblers, after a hard week's work in smoky towns and cities, we go out rambling for relaxation and fresh air. And we find that the finest rambling country is closed to us, and we request or demand access to those peaks, and it's nothing unreasonable. And I think that for me, that's sort of his work and the work that came, those workers that campaigned and the work that followed really sparked the creation of our organisation, and it sparked the creation of the National Park movement went on to with the 1949 Act, and which created national parks in the UK for the first time. And so for me, when I read about that story as a woman who grew up on a council estate, we never had any money, but I've always been passionate about the environment. And actually, for me, that was a real eye-opener when I read about Benny Rothman, because it was just really inspirational that someone from a working class background, and in a way I've sort of hidden my working class background to get on in the environment sector, but someone had actually been so fundamental and transformational in his work. And that's really inspiring to me, but also there's something inspiring to our organisation today, because we know that the national parks are still underfunded, and they're still, they're not working enough for nature, they're in decline, but also we know that access to the countryside is still really unequal. And lots of people, particularly, people that can't afford to run a car, people of colour, people from working class backgrounds are effectively excluded still from those national parks for all sorts of reasons. And so our mission today about reconnecting with those roots and, giving people access to the fresh air is as relevant today as it ever was. So.
Thank you. And you kind of spoke about that historical context, which I think does get lost sometimes certainly in the mainstream debates. And certainly we know that when people started going out into the countryside as cars happened, the railways happened, there was a sense of consuming the countryside. And very often, the people who are mobile were able to kind of write about that stuff. And I wonder and we've kind of touched on it a little bit already, but kind of why now for this prize? Like, what do you think the pressing issues are? I mean, we've mentioned climate emergency and so on, but is there anything else that's really do we think that's really pushing the need now more than ever for this kind of movement? And that's to either of you.
To me, it's about, again, it's about authentic voices, and it's also about just reading and listening to different stories. It's you get bored listening to, I mean, you do, the same people saying the same things. And for me, you're talking about working class, how they were able to go out to the country, but the country was very much a working class place. For me, I'm from rural Cornwall, so for me, it's the opposite. So I'm born and raised in Cornwall, so we couldn't afford to be going into cities and going into towns. So I come from a different perspective there, but still, I've had to kind of fight in many ways to get my voice heard because of being working class. So soon as you say you're working class, and I'm white, so I mean, there's a lot worse for a lot of other people. People just dismiss it and say, well, you don't fit in that box. So that's why the prize is so important, because it's challenging people's perceptions of nature writers and saying we can all be nature writers, no matter who we are and where we come from. And that's what's brilliant about the prize and connecting with national parks, is because the work will be on their website as well. So as well as their part of their prize is as a year's membership, it's also their work will be publicized and put on all their social channels. And I think that's really important as well, because that's a way for us all to connect, which is quite a simple way, but it's a very effective way, because I'm not just saying, send me your work and we'll, you get a prize kind of thing. I mean, the prize is brilliant, but it's about seeing their work published as well, which is really important. And also, if I can just mention Octopus Books rather, and Gaia, who are one of our main sponsors as well. So they've helped with all the kind of the nitty gritty of the prize, and they're giving book bundles and that sort of thing. And also Arvon have very kindly donated a course, which is what's brilliant about the Arvon course. It doesn't have to be one of their in-person ones. It can also be the online, which I think is really important, because a lot of people have access problems or childcare or that kind of thing. So I think that's really important as well, that Arvon have stepped up, as well as National Parks and Gaia. So yeah, it's brilliant.
Thank you. And Rose, do you want to have anything to add kind of in terms of the why now and the kind of and the different challenges facing this kind of work at the moment?
Yeah, I think the first thing, obviously, we've seen this huge sort of nature awakening across the population after the COVID pandemic, and people were getting outside, lots of people getting outside more than they had done before, and they'd had that moment to sort of stop and reconnect with nature. But actually, that was very much some people. And actually, we've seen the sort of inequalities that we see in terms of access to nature sort of in many ways widen and deepen during the pandemic. So there's a reason there, I think, to really think about, that makes this issue even more important. But also there's something about just different ways. Like, I think one of the things that we learned to connect with nature, one of the things that we learned through the pandemic is realize that, in a way, connecting to nature, you don't have to go a really long way. You can just look outside your window and in a way it was quite humbling and in many ways could be more egalitarian, because, it was talking about the everyday ways that we can connect with nature. And I think that's really important, because often in our sector, people and nature are almost pitted against each other. We see this in the national parks, and there's almost this sort of actually a sort of one sort of perspective that it would be better to just close off national parks from people, because then we can protect the nature in them. And actually, I think there's something really important now to think about, well, actually, we can't solve the nature and climate crisis unless we think about how we do that with people. And so rather than other them and keep them out, we need to think about how to connect with them in different ways. But I also think Natasha's point about landscapes being working landscapes in many ways, and thinking about the people that work the landscape is also really important, because I think, again, we have this sort of characterization of people who own land and, work land as being like quite rich and well off. And actually, there is quite a lot of rural poverty. And we see that with the people that we work with in national parks. You're seeing this huge demographic challenge because young people can't afford to live and work in national parks anymore. So I think that there are these gaps that are widening and deepening. So it's even more important that we talk about these stories now.
Yeah, there's a couple of kind of strands I wanted to kind of pick out from what you both said. And I think the first one is kind of acknowledging, you know, the intersectionality of the stuff that we're talking about here. And so if people are not familiar with that term, that kind of basically relates to the way in which all the different characteristics and facets of our identity come together, whether that's gender and sexuality, socioeconomic background or whatever, and how they can add to one another to either give people opportunities they might not otherwise have, or actually otherwise deny people opportunities. So obviously there's an emphasis here on working class, but that is an inclusive kind of category, I assume, that we're talking about here, a way of understanding a particular facet of people's experience. Because we've seen lots and lots of work, amazing work, which kind of encourages which is trying to find other ways to bring people into the space of nature. So I just kind of wanted to see if there was anything you guys wanted to talk about in relation to that kind of acknowledgement, I guess.
I think the whole thing about going out into nature, I mean, as Rose was saying about during lockdown, and people were looking out their window and all of a sudden they were noticing a spider, you know, or they're noticing a bird. I mean, that's literally nature coming to you. And I think that's what's really important. Sometimes it's not just about going out into nature, because it is everywhere. It's a weed growing up in a pavement, you know, and it's taking time to look at the small things, not just the big things, and connecting the whole of nature. I mean, like today in Cornwall, it's like 17 degrees. It's really warm and it feels wrong. And I can see flowers in bud, and I can, you know, and I'm just thinking, well, coming back to the whole environmental issues, we need to be writing about the environment. We need to be writing about the climate emergency from wherever we are. So it's not just us in the country, but it's also people in cities. You know, everyone is experiencing different things. And I think it's really important that we record those things as well. We're recording it for future so we can learn from our findings now. And those people who we need to be recording is people who live everywhere. And they do live in cities, and they live, you know, in the country and everywhere between, as I say, because we are the ones that are going to be able to help people understand what we're going through now and make changes. It's those small things that we're noticing. So we're not just rushing around through life and just thinking that everything's fine. And somebody in politics, who it won't be, will be sorting things out for us, because it won't. It'll be us. It'll be the small people. It'll be the workers, you know, definitely. So I think it's really important that we take away the banner of nature writer, and it's just we're all nature writers, because that's what we should be doing. We should be kind of sharing our work and making new connections, I suppose, as well. Like, that's why this Communicate is such a good idea, because we're all making connections, and I know Rose is the same. We're both, you know, very happy for people to get in contact with us after this event, you know, so we can forge forward and make new relationships, really, and kind of sort things, I guess.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, Natasha. And I think that actually one of the things that I've learned from being involved in a lot of conversation about diversity and inclusion in the sector, including at Communicate, actually, which has been a good forum for that, is that one of the most important things is to recognise that people's experiences of nature are different, and there is a diversity there, and in that way that's very legitimate. And I think one of the things that historically the sector has done is portrayed a sort of behavioural code, or this is the way that you engage with nature, and it's almost very sort of values laden and comes from that almost sort of scientific sort of Gilbert White sort of way that ecology and conservation in a way sort of came into being as a subject. But I think that one of the reasons that the Nature Prize is, you know, is really important about that, telling stories, is to recognise that there are lots of legitimate ways that people engage with nature that are in many ways not talked about. And so, for example, my sort of earliest connections with nature were because my dad used to earn, you know, extra cash in hand by going to pick clams on Portsmouth Harbour in order to, you know, to help us get by. And he spent a lot of our weekends were sitting out on Portsmouth Harbour, playing on the mud, watching the birds, out on the, you know, out playing around in boats. And that was really, you know, formative for me. But I don't, you know, it was one of those things that as a kid, you learn not to talk about it, because your dad says, don't tell anyone about that, because, like, you know, you don't want the taxman chasing up with you. So I think, and in working in Natural England, you know, I know that there was a big sort of push that they needed to stop these things because it was bad for nature conservation, you know, for the SAC. So I think there's something about, in many ways, lots of some of these working class experiences, in some ways, are sort of, they are bundled up with like things that are on the periphery of what was legitimate and acceptable by the mainstream. And there's a sort of, I think that's why we need to tell those stories, actually, to make sure that people can talk about that. And I remember when Anushka Rawdon, who is a brilliant person that works for the South Downs National Park, she talked in a blog about her experience with her dad picking cockles. And I was just like, yes, I found someone else that had this experience like me. And that was really important for me, I think, to just, and I'm someone who's, you know, a chief executive of a charity, and it's still really important for me to find people that have had similar experiences. So yeah,
I think that's so that sense that the power of the dominant kind of way we talk about nature, like it's sneaking into the questions, the way I'm framing my questions for you, even though I totally agree with everything that's been said here and my own experience growing up in nature and in relation to nature, kind of very much kind of maps onto what you've described. So it is very powerful, the way we talk about going out into and that kind of stuff. And I guess there's one other thing I'd like to touch on really is that, well, I guess one thing I'd like to touch on before we kind of move into maybe some of the mechanics of how we can start thinking about how we actually support, you know, organizations and writers about thinking about this stuff, is just that sense of how we kind of redraw those boundaries about what nature writing is and isn't, or in fact just reject that term, and how the prize, but also other initiatives you might be involved in, are kind of seeking to kind of help understand that people always have the permission and the experience of nature to talk about it, if you see what I mean. So that permission should already be there, and that experience, as Natasha said, is already there just by looking out of the window. So what do you think the prize or the festival that you organise as well, Natasha, how can they move towards that shift in mindset?
It's about representation. So when people see themselves represented on the page or on the stage, that's basically what it is. And there's writers like Anita Sethi, for example, who has, you know, burst open that stereotype. And that's why it's important, because for her, young Asian writers will see this incredible writer, this incredible nature writer, and she's just claimed nature writing. And people were like, well, you don't seem like a nature writer. And that's exactly it. It's like, well, what does a nature writer look like? You know, we've had this argument with 100 different things, but really that's what it's all about. It's young, especially young people, looking at nature writers and go, oh, well, that's like me. I've had so many people say, especially when they send in their work for the prize over the last 3 years, I didn't think I was a nature writer, and yet I write about nature. And it doesn't have to be nature as we all think of nature when we immediately think of it. It's the gritty, it's the, you know, it's the dirt under the fingernails as well. It's not just the beautiful, the pretty, it's the grubby, as Rose was saying, you know, it's the jobs that we have done, especially as working class or our forefathers. You know, for me down here in Cornwall, it's the fishing industry, it's the mining industry. So it's all that as well. But the more people see people claiming nature writing, then that's what it's about. And that's the same for me with Class Festival as well, which I know, Simon, you were a part of this time last year. Class Festival, it's the same. It's about representation. It's about those authentic voices, people hearing those stories, not being filtered through a middle class filter, not somebody else telling the stories. And of course, with Class Fest, everyone's invited. It's not an us and them thing. It's not. I've not created a working class ghetto at all, but it's a celebration of authentic voices, and it's saying, look, we are writers. We can write literary fiction. You know, we can write nature writing. It's just opened up those doors. And for a lot of people might think, what is she talking about? It's because the world of publishing and literature is predominantly still, the gatekeepers, as it were, are all middle class, especially in publishing, predominantly white. And they are the ones who filter who will be published or who will kind of get through the door, same as magazine editors. And so that's really my work as artistic director of Class Festival, and also my work with the Nature Prize, and also as a writer, you know, is just me saying, come and talk, say your voice, you know, tell me your books. I've guest edited The Bookseller just a quick plug, which is coming out on Friday as the first working class issue ever, which is brilliant. And it's jam-packed full of incredible working class writers, a great spectrum of people, and also a preview of books that are coming out by working class writers end of this year and throughout next year. So, and that's really important as well. So I think for people to see how many books are starting to come through by working class writers, it's turning. It's very slow, but it is turning. And it's the same in nature writing as well. So it's just to say to people, you are a nature writer, own it. If you want to call yourself a nature writer, if you want to write about nature, and it's the nature of self as well as, the nature reflected in yourself. I mean, that's it. I think if anything ever becomes too pigeonholed, that's the problem. So it's about celebrating, because at the end of the day, we're all going to hear some brilliant voices from all over the country that aren't just that stereotype, because, that can be a bit boring, and nature isn't boring.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And one of the best things about us being able to sponsor the prize is one of the winner will get a paid commission for our members magazine. And paid bit is really important, actually. But it's part of a wider piece of work that we're doing at Campaign for National Parks called National Parks New Perspectives, which is just trying to create a space really for our people to tell different stories or share different perspectives of their experiences of national parks. And someone has put a link, I think, to Cressia's City Girl and Nature's film, which she did for us earlier this year, which was about her experience as a woman living in London, working class background, and her friends who'd gone to a national park for the first time. And it was just a really magical film, actually. It just really is really rewarding to watch, soul nurturing, because it just it talks about how these places can move you. And I think that one of the things, I think, for us as an organisation and generally in the sector for organisations is just to give people space to tell those stories, and also to give a bit of power. So with the New Perspectives work, we didn't commission any structure to that other than, needs to be about national parks. And then just being able to just sit back and just be confident to let them tell their own story as well, and not try to shape it or fit it with a corporate narrative. I think that's really, really important.
Yeah, fantastic. And something that you both sort of been touching on with that really is the kind of the infrastructural challenge. There's lots of different sort of touch points or moments where people could get involved or could make those changes, but there's also many that prevent those things from happening. So we've talked a little bit about as a writer feeling as if you're, you have a valid voice, but then there's also the kind of the architecture of publishing industry. So agents, how do you meet somebody who might publish your book? How do you convince somebody that your voice is legitimate when you yourself may be challenging, maybe struggling with that kind of concept as well? And then I think also, obviously, as you just said, there's sort of how do you invite people into a national park or into a traditionally natural space? So I guess I was just wondering if we have any, given the audience we have here today as well, and the kind of work that lots of us are doing about kind of communicating and challenging and trying to kind of share that. Do you have any other thoughts on how we address some of those different touch points, I guess, where people might come into a space or might feel unwelcome in a space, and how we might start thinking about that practically? I mean, I think the prize is a great example of that, because obviously you've got paid commissions, you've got access to training, you've got the prize itself, and you've got kind of all the stuff that comes with it. That's a really great suite of things. But are there other things you can think of that we collectively might start to do?
I think collectively, when you invite people to be a part of your organisation or to join the conversation in some way, if it's in person, always, if it's somebody you want to come and speak, always pay. I mean, most people do, but some people don't offer to pay, and even if it's just something small, it should be a small fee, and also travel and that sort of thing. I mean, that comes up a lot with writers, even writers who are, been in this industry a long time, but none of us are making much money, at the end of the day. So always offer people travel and accommodation, but also it's about asking people what they want, not just thinking, right, this is what we're going to do. We're going to start an initiative to get more and working class or whatever corner of diversity you want to explore or work with in your in your business or your organization, is asking people what they want, how they see it. Don't just think, right, this is it. This is exactly how we see it. So it is definitely about communication. And it's also about embedding in your policy, working class. I mean, everyone has a diversity policy, or they should, but also working class is always often the last thing that people think about. But if you even just want to take away working class, you just have to think about people who come from low social economic backgrounds, which is going to get worse, is worse going into 2023. There's going to be a lot of people that can't afford to do anything. But if you want them to be a part of the conversation, you need to invite them in, and you need to make sure that they are that what they have to say is valid. Otherwise, we're going to end up with organizations that are just, again, the same people. Look at your board, look at the people around you and think, you know, are we all a little bit the same? We're animals, we naturally choose like, you know, and that's important to say, you know, we're all a little bit the same. We need to kind of shake things up a bit. Those people who are making decisions in organizations. So that's really important. Just be aware all the time and look a little bit further out of your circle of influence. Yeah.
Just to add to that, I mean, one of the most, I guess, one of the best things that I've personally been involved in was at Natural England, because it was part of the civil service. The civil service has a social mobility network, which is aiming to address the very real gaps in sort of progression in terms of the class gaps across the professions in the civil service. And so, for example, it had a way of measuring, you know, class as part of diversity. And actually that's something, you know, we've adopted in Campaign for National Parks. But there are some simple things that we could do to start really talking about class and thinking about class and thinking about representation. One of the best things about that network was it was just a safe space for people from a working class background to come together and share their experiences. And it sounds, you know, obvious, but actually that was really, really, really important. And for many people, and myself included, it was a place where many people had really talked about this in the work context and actually had actively hidden it and tried to assimilate and pretend to be working class through like ditching your accent and all of that you try to do to get ahead. But it was a really important way to just, one, to sort of be able to share experiences, in some cases, you know, painful and really hard to get to where they were in their career from the backgrounds that people had had, but also really, really great to hear the different, again, stories of how nature had been such an important part of their lives and driven them, and they, you know, and then taken forward a career in it. And so I think that more of that, and I'd be, you know, if anyone listening today would be interested in doing something like that in the NGO sector, do, you know, contact me. I'd be really interested in that, because the more that I've started talking about class, the more that I find that there are quite a lot of people from working class background in our sector. It's just that it's a little bit hidden, and I mean, that's why today's session, and I'm so pleased with Natasha doing the prize, because it's actually started a conversation, and so hopefully we can go on from there and continue to have one.
Just thank you. Yeah, I'm sort of minded to slightly plug the work of a colleague of mine as well, Tony Bajam, who works at Watershed in Bristol, has been doing a lot of work as part of a project we're on, which is around for organizations particularly to try and understand how they can kind of start welcoming those conversations, recognizing the inherent and positive differences and stuff. And he talks a lot about touch points, but in his work with some people, Jaslyn Pinkney and Jill Wildman, they've kind of started to put together a workshop that really helps encourage conversations about, you know, what do you have the power to change? You can't change everything, and you can't change it all at once. You know, small things, seemingly small things like changing your board, as Natasha says, you know, just starting conversations, all that kind of stuff. So I'll put a little link in the chat to some of that kind of work as well, because I think that's also really valuable, because it ties this stuff together, which is about that kind of thinking. Natasha.
Yeah, I just linking in with Watershed. We Class Festival, I've just got some big funding from a publisher. I'm not allowed to say until Friday when we announce the news in the press, but it means that we've got the first brick in order to build Class Fest 2023. And just going what you were saying, Simon, it will be at Watershed, fingers crossed, in 2023 in the autumn. And if anyone wants to get in touch with me, I'm happy to chat about partnering up, because the more the merrier, really. I can't, you know, the communication, absolutely, and shared experience, it's so important to me. So if anyone's interested who's participating today, then please get in touch. Thanks.
Amazing, thank you. Yeah, and that sense of collaboration, I think, is very important with organizations to the extent that, you know, that you can, because sometimes if you're an organization that's not dedicated to a particular kind of work, but there are experts out there, you don't have to reinvent the wheel, and there are ways you can make those kinds of connections. And I think the Nature Writing Prize is a fantastic example of how, and ClassFest as well, as how you started to kind of pull those threads together. Do either of you have anything else that you'd sort of like to add before we kind of move into some of the questions from the audience? Anything that you wish I'd asked you or wanted me to say?
Looking forward to the questions, actually, Simon. I think that's always good fun.
Fantastic. So I'm going to have a little look through the questions here. So I think we had a question from Penny, which is sort of about Penny Mason, which is about the kind of major sort of biggest practical barriers for getting voices heard. And I kind of think that we've touched on those with some positive examples of how we can make that change, you know, as we were just discussing in the last question. But do you have any other kinds of barriers to getting these voices into your environment, into your working stuff that you wanted to flag?
For me, sometimes people can be quite, you know, I suppose, insecure. So it's always making sure that at first, you know, certain people might be a little bit of bravado. In publishing, it might be bravado, it might be insecure, and those two things are often interlinked. So it's really kind of creating it sounds kind of silly, I suppose, to say a safe kind of place, but allow people to let you know what they want, not just think, oh, this person is angry. Because I get a lot of people as artistic director of ClassFest who are, why my book, why can't I come to the festival, you know, and I have to be so kind of, well, it's not right for this particular panel or whatever, you know, and sometimes that is hard with all people, but you do have to kind of give people a little bit of space to kind of think, well, okay, this person, what are they coming from? They probably had loads of nutbacks, you know, and because we don't have mates, most of us haven't been to university, so we don't have those mates at university who we then, you know, oh, his dad works at the Guardian, they're going to do a book review for me. It's that, you know, we miss out on a lot as working class writers. So you have to make sure that, you know, or anyone in your staff, we sometimes come from a different place. And as Rose was saying, that assimilation, that was the number one word when I did when I talked to so many editors and publishing for the bookseller that's coming out on Friday, is assimilation. And then people are kind of then quite cross with themselves, but they've had to assimilate, they've had to change their accents, they've had to dress a certain way, you know, and that's it. Be aware of people, because also one thing that people talk about is like celebrating a book. I mean, I'm coming from publishing now, so this is my world. Celebrating a new book out, but you know, you pay for your drinks, you have to dress a certain way. You know, people don't always have that money, especially at the start of their careers. So yeah, I think the more we all talk about it, the less people can be their true selves, which is only good. Yeah, the authenticity again. Why not?
So we have another question from Mark Leach, which is kind of about what we were talking earlier about how we, I guess, articulate the kind of work we're talking about. He was wondering if there's a kind of a distinction between writing about climate change and writing about nature, and whether that has a bearing on how potential authors and writers and people orient themselves to the work. So obviously nature potentially may seem more, dimensions might seem sort of more more immediate, more non-technical. Maybe climate change has a slightly different kind of thing. Do you think there's something in the way we're framing those things which are the same as separate?
Yeah, I think they do, especially in publishing. All my books are all my fiction are classed as cli-fi, so climate fiction, and that's it's a big part of my books. I call it Justopia because it's almost like it's just happened or it's just about to happen. Justopia, it's that point of climate change, which we're kind of at now, you know, with the weather and everything else. So, but yeah, when you talk about climate change and cli-fi, it's like, oh, that's a bit nasty, a bit scientific, and nature writing is always just, you know, a robin sitting on the handle of my shovel in snow, nature writing. And the two things are completely matched. But that's what I was saying, nature writing is grubby and dirty, and it's that's how it should be. So cli-fi, those kind of novels and those kind of poems and everything else, it's all should be, it's all the same. Absolutely, it's the same. And I wish there was more of that kind of merging, because writing about climate change and cli-fi and all those kind of, there's lots of different ways to kind of call those books, but then it's nature writing. It's all nature writing, and it's the most important type of nature writing, actually, in my opinion.
And just to add to that, I think if you look around the world at some of the more international work, and especially work to sort of bring Indigenous voices into climate, debates and forums, I think that actually there are some really good examples of where, these things have become more merged and they're more relevant, as Natasha said, to sort of like the common people. And I think that's something we over technocratic, we put an artificial separation, but hopefully that's changing. And I also think that if you just look at the sort of statistics in terms of people's attitudes around climate and nature, you don't see the really big sort of class differences there. I think it's about just how, a lot of this is about the stories we tell rather than necessarily any inherent sort of bias.
So we've got time for about one more question. So I'm going to do something where we squish together two questions into one. So Stacey Duncan asks, what advice would you give to someone who'd like to start nature writing? And Ollington Matthews Paris has also asked for tips for new working class writers who may not have had a formal classical education, and where you'd point them for help with prose and structure. So obviously thinking of the Arvon kind of bit of the prize there. So what advice would you give to kind of aspiring writers?
For me, I've written all my books outside, so it's wild writing, and I've often taught it as workshops. But it's just getting outside, getting rid of your laptop, getting rid of any screens, because we spend our lives just looking through screens predominantly. Even if you're looking out of a window, a car window, phones. So get rid of all the screens and immerse yourself in nature, and write with a pencil or a pen. The pencil's better when it's raining because it can still work, and a pad, and get outside in all weathers, because that's where nature is. And it doesn't matter if you're in the city, it doesn't matter if you're in a cul-de-sac, it doesn't matter if you can't get far or you're just sitting in your garden. You just have to immerse yourself in as many ways as you can. And that's for me as a writer, that's my biggest tip for writing. I've never suffered from writer's block, because you're there. It's almost like you're getting rid of that filter of I'm sitting at a computer or I'm sitting at my phone. It's unfiltered. There's no phones ringing. There's no distraction. You're not sitting at your computer and you think, oh, I need to get the Hoover and do a bit of housework. You're out writing, and that's it. I don't think you have to follow. I've never followed. I left school at 15. I've never followed any way of writing. I've just read a lot. So my favorite writers, who are mostly country writers, rural writers, that's how I kind of learnt to write, I suppose, just by reading and just by exploring nature. And that to me it's all about. Yeah, and that's what I'm just gonna, a shameless plug. My Undercurrent is coming out in April, and that's all about that. It's about being a young writer growing up in poverty and wanting to write, and how to get away from that, from poverty, and learn from nature. And that's how I did it. I was just outside the world, outside the nature of the world, and what was that inside of me, and matching those two things. So yeah, get outside and write.
Fantastic, thank you very much. Rose, do you have any tips for that, for aspiring people wanting to get involved? We've got about 1 minute left.
No, I would just say that I think one of the things at the moment is that most of the sector, conservation environment sector, do not have very good connections to working class writers. So it's not that, and they probably, it's not that these people aren't there, and it's just that we are, we can't reach them because the sector doesn't have the infrastructure and the connections. So I think, if you're a working class writer and you want to, maybe there's, just offer, email your local wildlife trust and I'll ask them if they want, because they'd probably bite your hand off. I know that we would, and if people do, and like Natasha said earlier about the importance of networks, so that's one thing I've learned, that you don't learn when you're from a working class background. You don't have those connections and networks. So, and if anyone wants to contact me, I'll put my email in the chat, that I think that you just need to sort of try and take advantage of the ones that you can. you can, where you can.
Amazing, thank you so much. And if anybody wants to talk to me about zine publishing, self-publishing and DIY as a wonderful way to find your voice and make connections across other creators who aren't represented in the mainstream, because you just go ahead and represent yourself, and how that can work, I'm always happy to do that as well. You can contact me in lots of different ways. I can put my in there. Right, well, we're at 11:45. That means we have to say goodbye. But I just want to say thank you so much, Natasha and Rose. What a wonderful conversation and what important work. And as ever with these things, this is just one step along the road to positive change. So thank you everyone for coming, and thank you for your time.